In the summer of 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shannan Gilbert disappeared on Long Island, New York. At first, her disappearance seemed like many other missing person cases that police deal with every year. But what investigators did not realize at the time was that this single disappearance would lead them to uncover one of the most disturbing serial killer cases in modern American history. Shannan Gilbert was living in New Jersey and working as an escort who found clients through online advertisements. Like many women in that line of work, she often traveled to meet clients late at night. On the evening of May 1, 2010, she had arranged to meet a client in a quiet gated community called Oak Beach, located along the southern shore of Long Island. Oak Beach was not an ordinary neighborhood. It was a small and somewhat isolated community made up mostly of vacation homes owned by wealthy residents. The houses were spaced far apart, surrounded by marshland and narrow roads. At night, the area could feel very quiet and deserted. That night, Shannan did not travel alone. She was accompanied by a driver named Michael Pack, whose job was to bring her safely to and from appointments. Drivers were common in the escort industry because meetings with strangers could be dangerous. Shortly after arriving at the client's house, something strange happened. According to later reports, Shannan suddenly became extremely frightened. She appeared to believe that someone was trying to harm her. In a panic, she called 911. The phone call would later become one of the most mysterious pieces of evidence in the entire case. For more than 20 minutes, Shannan remained on the line with the emergency operator. During the call she repeatedly said, "They're trying to kill me." But when the operator asked her who she was talking about, her answers were unclear. She sounded terrified. At times she seemed confused. She refused to explain exactly what was happening inside the house. Eventually she ran outside into the darkness. Her driver, Michael Pack, tried to calm her down and convince her to return to the car so they could leave the area. But Shannan refused. Instead, she ran down the quiet street, knocking on doors and begging for help. Several residents later reported seeing her that night. One neighbor said she appeared extremely frightened and disoriented. Another resident opened the door and briefly spoke with her, but could not understand what she was afraid of. Then Shannan ran off again into the darkness. After that moment, she disappeared. No one saw her again. When police were first notified about the missing woman, they initially treated it as a standard missing person investigation. Unfortunately, cases involving escorts sometimes received less attention because investigators believed the women might have simply left voluntarily. But Shannan's family refused to accept that explanation. Her mother pushed police to continue searching. Months passed with no answers. Finally, in December 2010, Suffolk County Police began conducting a large search operation along Ocean Parkway, a long road running through the marshy coastline near Gilgo Beach. The search team used cadaver dogs trained to detect the scent of human remains. The terrain was difficult. The area was filled with thick brush, tall grasses, and swampy ground. But during the search, something unexpected happened. On December 11, 2010, one of the search dogs suddenly stopped and began barking near the side of the road. Officers approached the area. Hidden in the brush, they discovered human remains. At first, investigators assumed the remains belonged to Shannan Gilbert. But when they examined the body more closely, they realized something shocking. The remains belonged to another woman entirely. And she had been there for a long time. The woman was later identified as Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old escort from the Bronx who had gone missing in 2009. The discovery immediately raised serious questions. If Melissa Barthelemy had been left in this remote location, could there be more victims nearby? Police continued searching the area. Just days later, they made another discovery. A second set of remains. Then a third. And finally a fourth. All four victims were young women who had worked as escorts and advertised their services online. Their names were Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello. Maureen Brainerd Barnes. All four women had disappeared between 2007 and 2010. Their remains had been carefully placed along the same stretch of Ocean Parkway. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Investigators quickly realized they were not looking at random crimes. They were looking at the work of a serial killer. The media soon gave the case a name: the Long Island Serial Killer. Or simply LISK. The discovery shocked the entire country. But the investigation was far from over. In early 2011, police expanded the search area. What they found next made the case even more disturbing. Additional human remains began to appear in nearby areas. Some of the victims had been missing for years. In some cases, the remains had been dismembered. One discovery included the remains of a toddler girl. The possibility emerged that more than one killer might be involved. The Gilgo Beach area suddenly became the center of one of the most complex murder investigations in the United States. Meanwhile, the mystery surrounding Shannan Gilbert remained unresolved. Despite months of searching, her body had not been found. Many investigators began to believe that her disappearance might not be connected to the other murders. But the timing of everything raised difficult questions. Was her disappearance just a coincidence? Or had she somehow crossed paths with the same killer? As investigators dug deeper into the backgrounds of the victims, they discovered something chilling. After Melissa Barthelemy disappeared, someone had made several phone calls to her family. The caller had contacted her younger sister. During the calls, the man mocked the family and claimed that Melissa was dead. He refused to reveal where her body was. Police attempted to trace the calls. But the killer had been extremely careful. The calls were made from different payphones across Long Island. Whoever was responsible clearly understood how to avoid leaving evidence. Years passed. The investigation continued, but no suspect was arrested. The Long Island serial killer remained unidentified. Some detectives believed the killer might be a local resident familiar with the isolated coastline. Others suspected someone with knowledge of law enforcement procedures. Rumors and theories spread across the internet. But none of them led to an arrest. The case slowly became what investigators call a cold case. An unsolved mystery. But what no one knew at the time was that the man responsible for these crimes was still living a seemingly normal life. He had a job. A family. And he lived just a short distance away from the very places where the victims had disappeared. For 13 years, the killer remained hidden. Until finally, in 2023, investigators made a breakthrough that would shock the entire world. After the discovery of the 4 victims along Ocean Parkway, the investigation into the Long Island serial killer quickly became one of the largest homicide investigations in the history of Suffolk County. Police officers, detectives, and federal agents began working together to understand what had happened along the quiet stretch of road near Gilgo Beach. The victims all shared disturbing similarities. They were young women. Most of them worked as escorts and advertised their services online. They disappeared after meeting clients. And their bodies had been carefully placed in the same remote area along Ocean Parkway. Investigators believed the killer had chosen the location deliberately. The road ran between the Atlantic Ocean and large marshlands. It was isolated. At night, very few cars passed through. The thick brush and tall grass made it easy to hide remains. And because the area was so difficult to search, bodies could remain hidden for years. But as detectives studied the victims' backgrounds, another chilling detail emerged. Before Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in 2009, she had been communicating with a client using a prepaid cell phone. After her disappearance, her younger sister Amanda began receiving disturbing phone calls. The caller claimed to be the man who had killed Melissa. He mocked the family. He laughed. And he told Amanda that her sister was dead. But he refused to say where the body was located. The phone calls came several times over the following weeks. Each time the caller seemed calm and confident. He spoke briefly and then hung up. Police traced the calls as best they could. But the killer had been careful. The calls were made from different public payphones scattered across Long Island. Most of them were located in busy areas like train stations or near shopping centers. The pattern suggested something frightening. The killer was organized. He understood how to avoid being traced. He was careful not to reveal too much. For investigators, the case was becoming more complicated by the day. Then, in early 2011, something even more shocking happened. Police expanded their search along the coastline beyond the original discovery area. During this new search, officers began finding additional human remains. But these discoveries were different. Some of the remains had been left in separate locations. Others appeared to have been placed there many years earlier. In total, investigators eventually discovered the remains of at least 10 victims in the Gilgo Beach area. The victims included Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, Karen Vergata, an unidentified Asian male victim, and even the remains of a small toddler girl. The discovery of a child among the victims horrified investigators. It raised the possibility that the killer may have had more victims than originally believed. At this point, detectives began considering two disturbing possibilities. Either one killer had been responsible for all of the murders, or multiple killers had been using the same remote area to dispose of bodies. The investigation grew more complex. Hundreds of detectives worked the case over the years. Thousands of tips came in from the public. Police examined missing persons reports from across the country. They interviewed potential suspects. They reviewed phone records. They searched through online escort advertisements. But despite all of these efforts, the killer remained unidentified. Years passed. The case began to fade from the headlines. Many people feared the Long Island serial killer might never be caught. For the families of the victims, the pain never disappeared. Many of them continued pushing investigators to keep working. One of the most determined voices was Mari Gilbert, the mother of Shannan Gilbert. She believed strongly that her daughter's disappearance was connected to the other murders. Police were not convinced. Investigators initially believed Shannan may have died accidentally after running into the marsh while she was panicking. But her mother refused to accept that explanation. In 2011, nearly 18 months after she vanished, Shannan Gilbert's remains were finally discovered in the marshland near Oak Beach. Her body was found less than half a mile from where she had last been seen running through the neighborhood. The official conclusion from investigators was that her death may have been accidental. They believed she could have become disoriented and drowned in the marsh. However, many people questioned that conclusion. The strange 911 call, her obvious fear, and the discovery of multiple murder victims in the same area. All of it made the case feel unfinished. Meanwhile, the search for the Long Island serial killer continued. Detectives examined hundreds of possible suspects. Some theories suggested the killer might be a truck driver who traveled frequently. Others believed he might be someone who lived locally and knew the area well. Some people even speculated that the killer might have worked in law enforcement. But year after year, no arrest was made. Eventually, the case became what investigators call a cold case. It was not closed. But progress had slowed. For more than a decade, the Long Island serial killer remained a ghost. Someone who had killed multiple victims and vanished without leaving a trace. But in 2022, everything changed. A new investigative team was formed. And this time, detectives decided to approach the case using modern technology that had not been available when the murders first happened. What they discovered would finally bring them face to face with a suspect. A man who had been living a completely normal life while one of the most notorious murder mysteries in America remained unsolved. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach murders remained one of the most frustrating unsolved cases in the United States. Detectives had spent years following leads that went nowhere. They interviewed witnesses. They tracked phone records. They examined hundreds of possible suspects. But nothing was strong enough to make an arrest. Families of the victims were losing hope. Some people began to believe that the Long Island serial killer might never be identified. But in 2022, something changed. Suffolk County authorities decided to reorganize the investigation. A new task force was created specifically to re-examine the Gilgo Beach murders. This team included local detectives, federal agents, and digital forensic specialists. Unlike earlier investigators, the new team had access to advanced technology that had improved dramatically since the original crimes occurred. Modern DNA analysis. Cell phone data reconstruction. Digital records that had been difficult to analyze years earlier. The investigators decided to start from the very beginning. They carefully reviewed every piece of evidence collected since 2010. Thousands of documents. Phone records. Witness statements. Crime scene reports. And slowly, a new picture began to emerge. One of the most important clues involved the victims' phones. Investigators discovered that before several of the women disappeared, they had communicated with a client using a burner phone. A burner phone is a prepaid device often used by criminals because it can be easily discarded. For years, detectives had known about this phone. But tracing it had been extremely difficult. However, the new task force decided to examine the data again using updated technology. By analyzing old cell tower records, investigators were able to reconstruct the movement of the phone during the time the victims disappeared. The phone had been used in several locations around Long Island. But one area appeared repeatedly. Massapequa Park. This quiet suburban neighborhood was located only about 30 minutes from Gilgo Beach. Investigators began focusing their attention on people who lived in that area. They studied thousands of records. Then another clue appeared. Witnesses who had spoken to Amber Lynn Costello before she disappeared had mentioned something unusual. They said the client she was meeting owned a large pickup truck. This detail seemed small, but it became important later. The investigators searched vehicle registration databases. They looked for residents of Massapequa Park who owned pickup trucks matching the description. The list was still large. But detectives continued narrowing it down. Another piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Years earlier, investigators had recovered a hair from one of the victims' remains. At the time, the DNA technology was not advanced enough to identify the owner of the hair. But by 2022, forensic science had improved significantly. The new task force sent the evidence for advanced DNA testing. The results pointed investigators toward a possible family connection. That connection led them to a man named Rex Heuermann. Rex Heuermann was not someone who had attracted attention before. He was a middle-aged architect who worked in Manhattan. He owned a small architectural consulting business. On the surface, he appeared to live an ordinary life. He was married. He had children. He lived in a modest house in Massapequa Park. But as investigators looked closer, disturbing details began to appear. Heuermann owned several vehicles over the years, including pickup trucks similar to the one described by witnesses. His home was located very close to the areas where the burner phone had frequently traveled. And most importantly, records showed that his wife and children were often out of town during the time periods when several victims disappeared. Detectives began quietly monitoring him. They studied his daily routines. They watched where he went. They followed his movements through public records and surveillance. But the most important step was still ahead. Investigators needed DNA. Without DNA evidence, they would not have a strong case. But obtaining DNA from a suspect without alerting them can be difficult. So detectives decided to wait for the right moment. And that moment came in a surprisingly ordinary way. One day in early 2023, Rex Heuermann was walking through Manhattan near his office. Like many people, he stopped to eat food during the day. After finishing his meal, he threw away a pizza box in a trash can. Investigators who had been watching him retrieved the discarded box. Inside was something extremely valuable. DNA. The pizza crust contained saliva. That saliva could be tested. The sample was sent to the lab. When the results came back, investigators finally had the answer they had been searching for. The DNA from the pizza crust matched the hair found on one of the victims. After 13 years, the Long Island serial killer investigation finally had a primary suspect. But detectives still had to be careful. They needed to build a strong case before making an arrest. Because the man they were watching had no idea that the police were now closing in on him. And very soon, the quiet suburban architect would become the center of one of the most shocking criminal arrests in recent American history. For months, investigators quietly watched Rex Heuermann. After the DNA from the discarded pizza crust matched the hair recovered from one of the victims, detectives finally believed they had found the man they had been searching for since 2010. But they could not rush. A case like this required overwhelming evidence. If they made a mistake, the suspect could escape justice. So the task force continued gathering information. They studied Rex Heuermann's life in great detail. At first glance, he appeared to be an ordinary man. He lived in a modest house in Massapequa Park with his wife and children. He owned a small architectural consulting company in Manhattan. His job involved designing buildings and construction projects. Every morning he took the train into the city, just like thousands of other commuters. To neighbors, he seemed quiet. Some described him as polite. Others said he mostly kept to himself. Nothing about him suggested he could be connected to one of the most notorious murder investigations in American history. But investigators saw something very different. They began analyzing his internet activity. Search records connected to devices in his home revealed disturbing patterns. According to investigators, someone in the house had searched for information about the Gilgo Beach murders many times over the years. There were also searches related to the victims themselves. Even more disturbing were searches involving violent and disturbing material connected to women. The investigators believed these searches could reveal the suspect's interests and behavior. But they still needed to connect him directly to the crimes. So detectives examined cell phone data. They discovered that the burner phone used to contact several victims had traveled in areas connected to Rex Heuermann. Cell tower records placed the phone near his home. And during the times when the victims disappeared, the phone moved along routes that investigators believed matched his movements. Another important detail also appeared. Records showed that Rex Heuermann's wife and children were often traveling outside the state during the exact periods when some of the victims disappeared. This meant he had been alone at home. For investigators, the evidence was slowly forming a complete picture. But they needed one final step. A search of his home. In July 2023, detectives obtained a warrant. Early one morning, police officers surrounded the quiet street in Massapequa Park. Neighbors were surprised to see dozens of police vehicles and investigators arriving. Shortly after, Rex Heuermann was arrested in Manhattan near his office. He was taken into custody without resistance. News of the arrest spread quickly across the country. For 13 years, the Long Island serial killer had remained unidentified. Now the world finally had a suspect. At the same time, investigators entered his home and began searching the property. Inside the house they found a large collection of electronic devices. Computers. Hard drives. Cell phones. Investigators believed these devices might contain important evidence connected to the murders. The search lasted for days. Police carefully removed boxes of materials from the home. Meanwhile, Rex Heuermann appeared in court. He was formally charged with the murders of several of the victims known as the Gilgo Four. During the hearing, prosecutors revealed some of the evidence they had gathered. They explained the DNA match from the pizza crust. They described the burner phone connections. They mentioned the disturbing internet searches. The courtroom was silent as the details were read. Families of the victims were present. Some had waited more than a decade for this moment. Many of them had never believed the case would finally reach this point. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to report the shocking news. The Long Island serial killer case had finally taken a dramatic turn. But the investigation was not finished. Prosecutors believed Rex Heuermann could be responsible for more murders beyond the Gilgo Four. Investigators continued examining the additional victims discovered along Ocean Parkway. The possibility remained that the true number of victims could be even higher. Meanwhile, Rex Heuermann maintained his innocence. Through his lawyers, he pleaded not guilty to the charges. The case began moving toward a trial that could reveal even more details about what happened along the quiet beaches of Long Island. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a mixture of emotions. Relief that a suspect had finally been identified. But also painful memories of the years they spent searching for answers. The Gilgo Beach murders had haunted Long Island for more than a decade. A place known for peaceful beaches and quiet neighborhoods had become the center of a terrifying mystery. Now, with a suspect finally in custody, investigators hoped the truth would finally come to light. But one question still remained. Was Rex Heuermann truly the Long Island serial killer? Or were there still secrets hidden along the lonely stretch of road near Gilgo Beach?